My name is Claire Dawson. I was 33 years old the night my parents handed my younger brother a check for $80,000 while telling me they wished they could do more for me too. The strange part wasn't the money. It was the smile on my mother's face when she looked at me afterward. "You've never needed us the way Ethan does," she said. Everyone around the dinner table nodded as if she had just explained why the sky was blue. My father even laughed softly. "Claire's always been independent." Independent. That was the word my family used whenever they wanted to excuse forgetting me. When Ethan wrecked his first business, they rescued him. When he dropped out of college, they rescued him. When he maxed out 3 credit cards before turning 30, they rescued him again. And when he decided he wanted to open another business, they emptied nearly half of their retirement savings without blinking. Nobody asked whether I had dreams too. Nobody asked whether I had plans. Because in my family, I wasn't the child people worried about. I was simply fine. That single word followed me for almost my entire life. It also became the biggest mistake my family ever made. Because while everyone believed I needed nothing, I was quietly building a life none of them knew existed. 22 months later, the same people who called me fine arrived at my front door carrying a folder full of unpaid bills. And for the first time in my life, they needed me more than I had ever needed them. The decision I made that afternoon changed every relationship in my family forever. If you've ever been the child everyone assumed would always figure things out alone, then you'll probably understand exactly why I answered the way I did. I grew up in Carmel, Indiana, in a brick house with white shutters and a maple tree that turned bright red every October. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied. Inside, the rules were different. Nobody ever announced them. Nobody wrote them down. You simply learned them by living there. If Ethan stumbled, everyone ran. If I succeeded, everyone smiled for a few seconds and moved on. He was 4 years younger than me, charming in the effortless way some people are. Teachers adored him. Neighbors remembered his birthday. Cashiers somehow started conversations with him in grocery stores. He had a gift for making people believe everything would work out. Unfortunately, he believed it too. When he was 19, he decided college wasn't for him. My parents paid every dollar of the tuition he'd already wasted because, according to my mother, young people deserve a second chance. At 24, he opened a custom furniture shop. It lasted 11 months. The business closed. My parents paid the remaining debt. At 28, he announced he had discovered his real passion: a gourmet food truck. That dream disappeared before the first anniversary. Again, my parents stepped in. Every rescue became another reason to believe someone would always catch him. Meanwhile, I learned a completely different lesson. I got my first job at 16 shelving books in the public library. The pay wasn't impressive. But every Friday afternoon, I deposited part of every paycheck into savings before spending a single dollar. During college, I waited tables. After graduation, I became a certified public accountant at a regional accounting firm in Indianapolis. The work wasn't glamorous. Nobody applauded spreadsheets. Nobody celebrated tax season. But I loved something about helping broken numbers make sense. Maybe because numbers were honest. People could hide disappointment. Balance sheets couldn't. For 9 years, I worked long weeks, accepted every difficult client nobody else wanted, and quietly built a reputation for solving financial problems. Bonuses went into savings. Raises went into investments. Instead of buying luxury cars, I drove the same silver Toyota Camry until it had over 200,000 miles. Instead of expensive vacations, I spent weekends learning about small business finance, commercial lending, and investment strategies. None of this looked exciting. It wasn't supposed to. While everyone around me chased appearances, I chased stability. By the spring I turned 33. I had accumulated enough savings to make choices instead of excuses. My parents never knew. Not because I hid it. Because they never asked. Every Sunday dinner revolved around Ethan. His newest idea. His latest setback. His next opportunity. I listened. I smiled. I passed the mashed potatoes. And I slowly stopped expecting anyone to notice that my own life kept moving forward. Looking back, that may have been the greatest gift they accidentally gave me. Because when nobody expects anything from you, you become free to build without an audience. The dinner that changed everything happened on the first Sunday in May. My mother had cooked roast chicken. My father had opened a bottle of wine he normally saved for birthdays. I should have realized something was coming. My parents only used the good china when they wanted a conversation to feel important. Ethan arrived 20 minutes late carrying blueprints rolled under one arm. He looked excited. The way people do when they've already imagined the ending before writing the beginning. "You guys are going to love this," he said. He spread the drawings across the dining room table. A coffee shop. Not just any coffee shop. He wanted to build what he called the neighborhood living room. Fresh pastries. Live music. Locally roasted coffee. Community events. He talked for almost half an hour without taking a breath. My mother looked at him as if he had already become the next great entrepreneur. My father nodded every few minutes. "It sounds promising," he finally said. Ethan smiled. "I found the perfect location downtown. There's just one problem." He paused long enough for everyone to lean in. "The bank wants a larger down payment." Nobody spoke. Then my father stood, walked into the study, and came back holding a white envelope. He slid it across the table. Exactly the way someone slides a winning lottery ticket. Ethan opened it. Inside was a cashier's check. $80,000. His hands started shaking. "Mom, Dad, you don't have to." My mother reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder. "We want to see you succeed. You deserve one more chance. One more." I quietly counted. By my math, it was at least the fifth. Everyone smiled. Everyone laughed. Everyone celebrated. I watched my brother cry. Then, without planning to, I heard myself speak. "I'm thinking about buying an office for my accounting practice next year." The room became strangely quiet. "I've been saving for a long time." I was wondering. I smiled. "Maybe someday you could help me a little too." My father looked down at his plate. My mother gave the same gentle smile she always used when she believed she was being kind. "Oh, sweetheart. You've always figured everything out yourself. We never worry about you." She reached over and patted my hand. "You'll be okay." That was it. No discussion. No apology. No promise. Just certainty. I looked around the table. Nobody thought anything unusual had happened. Ethan was already talking about espresso machines. My father was asking about construction permits. My mother was planning a grand opening party. The conversation had simply moved on. Without me, I finished dinner, helped load the dishwasher, hugged everyone goodbye, and drove home alone. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Across the top of the page, I wrote 6 words. "Stop waiting for someone to choose you." Then I drew a single line underneath. Everything that happened afterward started with that sentence. The following Monday, I arrived at the office an hour earlier than usual. The building was almost silent. Only the cleaning crew and the smell of fresh coffee filled the hallway. I unlocked my office, closed the door, and opened the notebook that had been sitting in my desk for nearly a year. Across the front it simply said, "Claire, private plan." Inside were pages of ideas I had been collecting for years. Nothing dramatic. Nothing flashy. Just small goals that nobody knew about. Open my own accounting firm. Specialize in helping family-owned businesses. Buy an office instead of leasing one. Build something that would still exist 20 years later. I stared at those pages for a long time. Then I added one more sentence. No more waiting for permission. That afternoon, I called a commercial real estate broker named Daniel Brooks. He answered on the second ring. "I've been thinking about buying a small office," I told him. "Nothing fancy. Just something practical." He laughed. "Those are my favorite clients. They usually end up making the smartest decisions." For the next 3 weeks, Daniel showed me properties all over Indianapolis. Some were beautiful and completely overpriced. Others were affordable, but falling apart. I said no over and over again. Not because I was afraid. Because I had spent too many years watching people confuse excitement with good judgment. Then one rainy Thursday, Daniel unlocked the door to a small 2-story brick building on a quiet corner. It wasn't impressive. The carpet needed replacing. The paint was 20 years old. The parking lot had weeds growing through the cracks. But the structure was solid. The location was excellent. And upstairs, there was enough extra space to lease to another professional. As Daniel talked about square footage, I quietly started doing math in my head. Purchase price, monthly payment, rental income, maintenance, insurance, property taxes. For the first time that month, every number made sense. Daniel stopped talking. You've gone quiet. I smiled. I'm buying this one. He blinked. Already? I've been making this decision for years. I just didn't know this was the building. The bank approved the loan 3 weeks later. The closing took less than an hour. When the final paper was signed, the attorney slid a single brass key across the table. I picked it up slowly. It wasn't just a key. It was proof. Proof that nobody had to believe in my future before I could build it. That evening, I unlocked the front door for the first time. The building echoed when I walked inside. Empty rooms. Dust floating through afternoon sunlight. Old fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I stood in the middle of what would become my office. And smiled. No applause. No family celebration. No congratulations. Just silence. The kind of silence that belongs to people building something for themselves. I locked the front door before leaving. Dropped the brass key into my purse. And drove home. Nobody in my family knew I had just become a property owner. Nobody even suspected it. For the first time in my life, that secret belonged entirely to me. Owning the building turned out to be the easiest part. Making it useful was something else entirely. Every weekday, I worked at the accounting firm until 5. Every evening, I drove 25 minutes to my building with a toolbox in the trunk and a notebook full of expenses. I couldn't afford to hire contractors for everything. So I learned. I watched videos on installing flooring. I learned how to patch drywall. I painted every wall myself. The first weekend, I finished exactly one office. It took 12 hours. When I finally stood back to admire it, I noticed I'd painted around an old light switch instead of removing it first. I laughed out loud. Then I repainted the whole wall. Progress wasn't glamorous. It was repetitive. Slow. Quiet. Exactly the opposite of every success story people posted online. One Saturday morning, while I was carrying boxes into the building, an older man from the office next door introduced himself. Name's Walter Green. He owned a small insurance agency. Judging by the framed newspaper clippings hanging in his lobby, he'd been there for over 30 years. You fixing this place yourself? He asked. I am. He nodded once. Good. Then he walked away. That was our entire conversation. 3 days later, I found a brand new paint roller sitting outside my office door. No note. No explanation. Just the roller. The next week, Walter knocked on my door. I've got an extra ladder if you need one. The week after that, he helped me repair a stubborn front door that refused to close properly. Walter wasn't the type to give speeches. He simply showed up. Little by little. Exactly when help mattered. One evening, after we'd finished replacing a broken ceiling tile, he looked around the empty office and asked, "Family helping you?" I smiled. No. He nodded as though that answer explained everything. Then he said something I wrote down that night. People who build quietly usually build stronger. I didn't fully understand the sentence then. I would later. By the end of summer, the upstairs office had been leased to a physical therapist starting her own practice. Her rent covered nearly half my monthly loan payment. Downstairs, I moved my own accounting business into the larger office. Instead of working for someone else's dream, I finally had a place that carried my own name on the front door. Dawson Financial Solutions. The sign wasn't expensive. Simple black letters on white glass. But every time I unlocked that door, it reminded me of something. Nobody had handed me an envelope. Nobody had written me a check. Nobody had cleared the path. Every brick in that building represented a decision I'd made myself. Meanwhile, Sunday dinners continued exactly as before. Ethan talked about his coffee shop. My parents talked about customers who hadn't even arrived yet. They asked me how work was going. Busy, I answered. That's nice, sweetheart, my mother said. Then she turned back to Ethan. For the first time. It didn't bother me. Because while everyone at that table was talking about plans, I was already living mine. By the time autumn arrived, my life had settled into a rhythm that almost nobody knew existed. Monday through Thursday. Clients. Financial reports. Tax planning. Business consultations. Friday evenings. Maintenance. Invoices. Budget reviews. Saturday mornings. Coffee from the bakery across the street and a walk through my building before anyone else arrived. I had discovered something strange. Owning a place changed the way you looked at the world. You stopped noticing decorations. You noticed roofs, parking lots, water stains, broken gutters. The things nobody applauded, but everybody depended on. Business slowly grew. Not because of advertising, because clients talked. One small business owner recommended another. A family-owned restaurant sent their supplier. A dentist recommended me to 2 other dentists. Every month, the calendar filled a little more. Every month, the savings account grew a little larger. I still lived in the same modest townhouse. Still drove the same Camry. Still packed my lunch most days. People assumed I hadn't changed. In reality, everything had. Then one Tuesday afternoon, something happened that reminded me my family and I were living in completely different worlds. Ethan walked into my office unannounced. He looked around slowly. The reception desk, the waiting area, the framed certificates, the conference room with clients sitting inside. For a moment, he looked genuinely impressed. I didn't know your office looked like this. I smiled. You've never asked. He laughed awkwardly. Fair enough. He wandered over to the coffee machine. You know, my cafe spins slower than we expected. I waited. He kept talking. The economy. People spending less. Bad timing. Every explanation pointed somewhere except himself. Finally, he looked at me. You think you could look over my books sometime? Just tell me if everything's okay. I nodded. Sure. Bring me everything. He smiled with obvious relief. I knew you'd help. 2 days later, he arrived carrying a cardboard box overflowing with receipts, invoices, unopened bank statements, and loose papers. I stared at the pile. When was the last time these were organized? He shrugged. I don't know. Maybe, never. It took me nearly 6 hours. By the time I finished, I wasn't worried about his bookkeeping. I was worried about his future. The coffee shop wasn't making money. It wasn't even breaking even. Sales were falling. Costs were rising. Equipment had been financed at terrible interest rates. Worst of all, he'd been using personal credit cards to keep the business alive without telling anyone. I closed the last folder. Ethan, you don't have a profit problem. You have a reality problem. He frowned. What does that mean? It means you've been pretending everything is fine because you're afraid people will think you failed. He looked away. I recognized that silence. I'd spent years sitting across family dinner tables listening to it. Only now, for the first time, I realized Ethan wasn't the villain I'd imagined. He was just another person trapped by everyone's expectations, including his own. Ethan didn't say anything for almost a full minute. He just stared at the spreadsheets spread across my conference table. Finally, he asked the question I'd been expecting. So, can you fix it? I leaned back in my chair. I can help you understand it. I can't magically fix it. He frowned. What's the difference? The difference is that one lasts. The other doesn't. He looked exhausted. Older than I'd ever seen him. For the first time since we were kids. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just tired. I slid a legal pad across the table. Write down every monthly expense. He sighed. Claire, I came here because you're the accountant. And I'm asking you to do the work. He stared at me for a second. Then, without another complaint, he started writing. An hour later, the page was full. I circled 3 numbers. These have to go. My apartment? No. The luxury SUV. The private marketing agency. And the warehouse you're renting for inventory you barely sell. He blinked. But people expect. I stopped him. No. You expect people to expect it. There's a difference. That sentence stayed between us for a long time. When he finally left my office, he carried a checklist instead of false hope. Sell the SUV. Cancel unnecessary subscriptions. Negotiate supplier contracts. Meet with the bank before missing another payment. Track every dollar. No shortcuts. No rescue. Just work. For the next several months. He actually followed it. Not perfectly, but honestly. Every Tuesday evening, he came to my office after closing. We reviewed numbers together. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes we sat in complete silence while correcting mistakes that should have been obvious. Little by little, his business stopped losing money. It still wasn't successful, but it was finally honest. Meanwhile, something else quietly changed. My father started dropping by my office. The first time, he claimed he was just driving past. The second time, he brought a toolbox. I noticed your front step wobbles. I'll fix it. He never asked permission. He simply repaired things. A loose railing. A leaking faucet. A broken cabinet hinge. When I tried paying him, he looked almost offended. I'm retired. I like fixing things. One chilly Saturday morning, while we were replacing an old exterior light, he suddenly said, "You know, I read every article about your business." I looked up. There were 3. I know. I kept them. He tightened one final screw before continuing. I should have asked more questions. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. My father wasn't built that way. But it was the closest thing I'd ever heard. I smiled. You could start now. He looked around my office building. What are you working toward next? It was such a simple question. Most people wouldn't even remember it. I did. Because in 34 years, nobody in my family had ever asked me that before. I didn't answer my father's question right away. Not because I didn't know. Because I had spent so many years answering questions about everyone else's future that talking about my own felt unfamiliar. Finally, I said, I want to buy the building next door. He looked across the parking lot. An old brick property with faded green awnings. Half the offices were empty. The landscaping hadn't been touched in months. It needs a lot of work, he said. I know. He nodded slowly. It reminds me of this place before you fixed it. For the next few minutes, we simply stood there. No lectures. No advice. Just 2 people looking at an old building. It felt strangely peaceful. That evening, I received a text from my mother. Family dinner Sunday. Don't be late. Asterisk, asterisk. Nothing unusual. At least, that's what I thought. Sunday arrived. The dining room looked exactly the same as always. The same white tablecloth. The same polished silverware. The same family photographs lining the hallway. Only Ethan looked different. He was quieter. He listened more than he talked. Halfway through dinner, my mother smiled proudly. I have wonderful news. She looked at Ethan. Tell everyone. He cleared his throat. The cafe's doing a little better. My father clapped him on the shoulder. See, I knew you'd turn it around. Then my mother looked at me. I told Ethan you've been helping him. I nodded. A little. She smiled. I always knew you'd look after your brother. There it was again. Not a thank you. Not recognition. Just another expectation. As though helping everyone else had simply been my role all along. Before I could answer, Ethan spoke. No. The room fell quiet. Mom looked confused. What do you mean? He set his fork down. Claire didn't rescue me. She made me do everything myself. My mother laughed. Well, she still helped. He shook his head. No. You and Dad always saved me. Claire taught me how to save myself. Nobody spoke. Even my father looked surprised. Ethan continued. Do you know what the hardest part was? She never gave me money. Not $1. She made me face every mistake. He smiled toward me. I hated her for about 3 weeks. I couldn't help laughing. So did I admitted. The whole table laughed. Even my mother. But her smile faded quickly. She looked thoughtful. Almost uncomfortable. Dinner ended shortly afterward. As I was putting on my coat, she stopped me near the front door. Claire, can we have lunch this week? Just us. It was the first time in years she had asked to spend time alone with me. I looked into her eyes. Something had changed. I just wasn't sure what. I'd like that, I said. For the first time in a very long time. I actually meant it. My mother chose a small cafe 20 minutes from her house. Not Ethan's. Somewhere quiet. The kind of place where nobody rushed you. She was already sitting by the window when I arrived. A cup of tea. A folded napkin. Hands wrapped around the mug the way people do when they're trying to keep themselves steady. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. The weather. My father's vegetable garden. A neighbor who had finally retired. Neither of us mentioned the real reason we were there. Finally, she looked at me. I owe you something. I waited. An apology. The word surprised me. My mother wasn't a woman who apologized easily. She stared into her tea. I thought I was being a good mother. I believed helping the child who struggled the most was the right thing to do. She smiled sadly. I never realized what it felt like to be the child everyone assumed would simply manage. I didn't answer. Not because I disagreed. Because I wanted her to finish. When you were little, you never asked for much. If Ethan wanted something, he'd make sure the whole house knew. You'd quietly find another way. She laughed once. I mistook your strength for a lack of need. There it was. The sentence I'd waited years to hear. Not an excuse. An understanding. I should have asked about your dreams. I should have celebrated your victories. I should have shown up. Her voice cracked on the last 3 words. For the first time, I saw my mother not as the referee of our family, but as a woman who had been making decisions she thought were loving, without realizing what they were costing. I reached across the table, covered her hand with mine. I'm not angry anymore. She looked up. You aren't. I was. For a long time. But somewhere along the way, I stopped building my life to prove something. I started building it because I loved it. A tear rolled down her cheek. I wish I'd seen it sooner. I smiled. So do I. We sat there quietly. No dramatic hugs. No movie speeches. Just 2 women trying to understand each other a little better than they had before. When the check arrived, she reached for it automatically. I gently slid it back toward myself. My turn. She laughed through her tears. You always do that. No. I smiled. I just finally can. She didn't argue. She simply nodded. As we walked toward the parking lot, she stopped beside my car. I drove past your office last week. I looked at her. It's beautiful. Simple words. But somehow, they meant more than every compliment I'd spent years hoping to hear. Life didn't become perfect after that lunch. Families rarely change overnight, but they can change direction. And sometimes, that's enough. Spring arrived with warm mornings and longer evenings. The building next door officially went up for sale. I called Daniel before the listing even reached the public market. 3 weeks later, after inspections, negotiations, and more paperwork than I cared to remember, the keys were mine. It wasn't the biggest purchase I'd ever dreamed about, but it represented something far more important. I was no longer building a business. I was building a legacy. The first person I called wasn't my mother. It wasn't Ethan. It was my father. He answered on the second ring. You busy? For you. Never. I laughed. I've got another building. There was a long pause. Then he said quietly, I'll bring my toolbox. 2 days later, he was standing beside me in an empty hallway wearing old work gloves and carrying the same dented toolbox I'd seen my entire childhood. He looked around. Where do we start? I handed him a floor plan. Everywhere. For the next 4 months, we worked almost every Saturday together. He repaired doors. I met contractors. He checked wiring. I handled permits and budgets. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we worked for hours without saying 10 words. It turned out, silence wasn't always distance. Sometimes it was trust. Ethan visited often too, not asking for advice, offering help. He painted walls, installed shelving, even cleaned windows without anyone asking. One afternoon, he stood beside me looking at the finished lobby. You know, I used to think success meant someone believing in you. He smiled. I was wrong. I looked at him. What is it then? He shrugged. Believing in yourself long enough that other people eventually notice. I laughed. That's actually pretty good. I know. I probably stole it from you. The grand opening wasn't fancy. No balloons. No ribbon cutting. Just clients. Neighbors. Friends. Walter from next door. Daniel. My father. Ethan. Even my mother came. She walked through every room slowly, stopping to admire things most people would have missed. The restored wood floors. The old brick walls we'd uncovered. The handmade sign at reception. When she reached me, she didn't hug me immediately. Instead, she looked around one last time and said, "I spent years thinking I knew what success looked like." She smiled gently. I was looking in the wrong direction. That was enough. I hugged her. Not because everything had been repaired. Some things never are. But because we were finally building something different. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I locked the front door, walked into my office, and hung the newest brass key beside the others inside a simple wooden cabinet. 5 keys. 5 chapters. None of them had been handed to me. Every one had been earned. I stood there for a long moment before turning off the lights. People often ask me what happened to the $80,000 my parents gave Ethan. The truth is, it disappeared years ago. Spent. Gone. Forgotten. But the confidence I built by creating something myself, that kept growing. Year after year. No market could take it. No bad investment could erase it. No one could hand it to me. And no one could take it away. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that being overlooked can feel painful. But it can also become the quiet space where you build the strongest version of yourself. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't the envelope someone else receives. It's discovering that you no longer need one.